The question came like a blade wrapped in silk. Tony Lewis didn't look up as Justinta approached table 12. Just waved his hand dismissively. We'll have the 2015 Chateau Margaux. You do know what that is, don't you? Yes, sir. The Bordeaux. Excellent choice. And, he finally looked at her, his expression cold. Tell me, what would you pair with the dry-aged ribeye? Since you're apparently so knowledgeable. It was a trap designed to expose ignorance he could mock. Justinta kept her voice steady. The Margaux would pair beautifully with the ribeye. The tannins complement the marbling. But if you prefer something bolder, the 2016 Barolo has notes of cherry and tobacco that elevate the char. Silence. Tony's jaw tightened. He'd expected her to stumble. His eyes went dead. Where are you from? Chicago, sir. No. Where are you really from? With that accent, her heart began to pound. I was born in Chicago. My parents are from Ghana. Tony leaned back, switching to Korean. Listen to how she talks. Like someone from a third world country. Then English, loud enough for the entire dining room to hear. Third world accent. Third-class citizen. How does someone like you even get hired here? Clean your way up from the kitchen? His associates erupted in laughter. The restaurant went silent. Justinta stood frozen, the wine list trembling in her hands. Years of dignity reduced to nothing by a man whose only achievement was being born wealthy. But she needed this job. Her parents' bills, nursing school, so she swallowed the rage. I'll bring your wine, sir. She walked away, his laughter following like poison. 3 hours later, Tony's Maserati wrapped around a telephone pole. Midnight at Chicago Mercy Hospital Emergency Department. Justinta pulled on her scrubs, eyes still red, heart still burning. 12:23 a.m. Paramedics burst through the doors. Male, early 30s, severe head trauma, unresponsive, BP dropping. Justinta looked up from the nurse's station and saw Tony Lewis' face. Unconscious, broken, bleeding, being wheeled into Trauma Bay 3. Her Trauma Bay. Justinta, I need you on this one. The attending shouted. Time stopped. In this hospital, his money meant nothing. In this hospital, she held all the power. What would she do now? If you're enjoying this story of karma and justice, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the most dramatic real-life stories every single day. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Now, let's get back to Justinta's story. 6 hours before everything changed, Justinta Scholes was exactly where she wanted to be. Mrs. Chen, let me help you with that. She appeared at the elderly woman's side as shopping bags began to slip from arthritic fingers. The woman had just finished lunch at Velvet Garden and was heading to her car. Oh, sweetheart, you don't have to. I insist. Justinta gathered the bags with practiced ease, walking the woman through the restaurant's elegant lobby and out to the valet station. The November wind bit through her uniform, but she stayed until Mrs. Chen was safely in her Mercedes, bags secured in the trunk. You're an angel, Justinta. The woman pressed a 20 into her hand. Just doing what my mama taught me. Justinta smiled, pocketing the tip that would go toward her parents' heating bill. Back inside, warmth embraced her. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, casting amber light across marble floors and white linen tables. Velvet Garden wasn't just a restaurant, it was where Chicago's elite came to see and be seen. Politicians, CEOs, old money and new money and money so old it had forgotten its origins. And Justinta moved through it all like she belonged. Justinta, a little girl's voice rang out. Maya, the daughter of a regular customer, ran toward her with arms outstretched. Justinta crouched down, catching the 6-year-old in a hug. Look what I drew for you. Maya thrust a crayon picture forward, stick figures with big smiles under a bright yellow sun. Is this me? Justinta pointed to a figure with a ponytail. Yes, and that's me and Mommy and Daddy and Bruno. Bruno was their golden retriever, currently tied to a chair leg, tail wagging furiously at the sight of Justinta. She scratched behind the dog's ears, making him lean into her hand with groaning contentment. You're such a good boy, aren't you? Table 7 needs water, Michael, the floor manager, called from across the room. But he was smiling. Everyone smiled around Justinta. She refilled glasses, cleared plates, recommended the Chilean sea bass to a nervous couple on their first date. She remembered that Mr. Rodriguez preferred his coffee black with 1 sugar. That the Thompson family always ordered extra bread. That Dr. Williams was allergic to shellfish. How do you remember all this? A new server asked during a brief lull. People like to be seen, Justinta said simply. Really seen, not just served. It was a lesson learned at her parents' kitchen table in their South Side apartment. Her father, Francis, had come to America from Ghana with nothing but an engineering degree and $50. Her mother, Abina, had worked 3 jobs while pregnant with Justinta. They'd sacrificed everything so their daughter could have opportunities they'd never dreamed of. Treat everyone with dignity, her mother always said in her Ghanaian accented English. No matter who they are. No matter how they treat you. That accent, the slight lilt in Justinta's vowels, the way certain words rolled off her tongue, was her inheritance. Her parents' sacrifice made audible. She wore it with pride. By 6 p.m., the dinner rush began. Justinta moved through the controlled chaos with grace, her smile never faltering. She didn't know that in 3 hours, that smile would be shattered. She didn't know that the man watching her from across the room, the one whose advances she'd rejected days ago, was about to turn her world into a nightmare. She didn't know that before this night ended, she'd be standing over his unconscious body with the power to destroy him completely. All she knew was that she loved this job, loved these people, loved the life she was building one kind gesture at a time. But kindness, she was about to learn, wasn't always enough to protect you from cruelty. Tony Lewis learned at age 7 that money could make problems disappear. The boy he'd pushed down the stairs at his private academy, the one who dared to score higher on the math test, ended up transferring to another school. No questions asked, no consequences, just his father's checkbook and a quiet conversation with the headmaster. Remember, son, his father had said, lighting a Cuban cigar in his penthouse office overlooking Lake Michigan, there are 2 types of people in this world. People like us, and people who serve people like us. Tony had never forgotten. Now, at 32, he sat in the back of his chauffeur-driven Maserati, scrolling through his phone with the bored detachment of someone who'd never had to work for anything. His suit cost more than most people made in a month. His watch, a limited edition Patek Philippe, could have paid off someone's mortgage. Mr. Lewis, we're approaching Velvet Garden, his driver announced. Tony didn't respond. Acknowledgement was for equals. Drivers weren't equals. He'd been born into the Lewis dynasty. 3rd-generation wealth built on his grandfather's shipping empire, expanded by his father's import-export business that everyone knew was code for something darker. Korean syndicate connections that stretched from Busan to Los Angeles to Chicago. Money laundered through legitimate businesses. Politicians bought. Judges owned. Territory protected by violence that never touched their family's pristine reputation. Tony had inherited it all. The wealth, the connections, the entitlement that came from never hearing the word, no. Except 3 days ago, he'd heard it. The memory still burned. He'd approached the black waitress at Velvet Garden, Justinta, he'd learned her name was, his hand finding her lower back in that proprietary way that usually made women melt or at least comply. Have dinner with me, he'd said. Not a question. A command dressed as an invitation. I'm flattered, but no thank you. Her smile had been polite but firm. The rejection had felt like a slap. In front of the bartender. In front of other staff. A nobody, a waitress, turning down Tony Lewis. His friends had laughed it off later at his penthouse. Forget her, man. She's not even your type. But that wasn't the point. The point was that everyone was supposed to recognize who he was. What he represented. The power he wielded with a single phone call. She probably doesn't even know who you are, his associate had joked, pouring expensive whiskey. That thought had festered like an infected wound. Not know who he was? Impossible. Insulting. Tony had built his entire identity on being recognized, feared, desired. At Seoul International Academy, he'd been the kid whose family donated buildings. At Northwestern, he'd been the one throwing parties on yachts. In Chicago's underworld, he was the man who controlled territory through his family's syndicate connections. People bowed. People obeyed. People understood the natural order. Especially people like her. Immigrants. Service workers. The kind of people who should be grateful just to breathe the same air as someone like him. His father's voice echoed in his head. Never let anyone disrespect you, especially not someone beneath you. Make examples. Make them remember. So Tony had made a decision. He'd return to Velvet Garden. He'd request her specifically. And he'd remind her, publicly, of exactly where she stood in the hierarchy of the world. As the Maserati pulled up to the restaurant, Tony checked his reflection in his phone screen. Perfect hair. Perfect suit. Perfect everything. Because that's what he was. Perfect. Untouchable. Shall I wait, Mr. Lewis? The driver asked. Obviously, Tony didn't look back as he stepped out. Inside, the maitre d' greeted him with the appropriate level of deference. Mr. Lewis, wonderful to see you. Your usual table? Table 12. And I want that waitress. The black one. Justinta. Of course, sir. Right away. Tony settled into the corner booth with 3 of his associates, men who understood power and how to wield it. Tonight wasn't about dinner. It was about teaching a lesson. About reminding everyone in this room who mattered and who didn't. He didn't know that in 3 hours, his Maserati would be wrapped around a telephone pole. He didn't know that karma was already writing a very different ending to his story. He didn't know that the woman he was about to humiliate would soon be standing over his broken body with the power to make him pay for every cruel word. All he knew was that tonight, he would put Justinta Scholes in her place. And everyone would watch. What he didn't know was that she would be the last person to say no to him and walk away unbroken. 3 days before karma would find him, Tony Lewis made his first mistake. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of slow night where Velvet Garden's usual buzz softened to a comfortable hum. Justinta was restocking wine glasses behind the bar when she felt someone's presence too close, too deliberate. You work here every night? The voice came from directly behind her, smooth and confident. She turned to find Tony Lewis leaning against the bar, his expensive cologne filling the space between them. She'd seen him before, always at the best tables, always surrounded by men in dark suits, always carrying himself like he owned whatever room he occupied. Most nights, yes. Justinta kept her tone professional, polite. Can I help you with something, sir? Tony. He smiled, the kind of smile that expected reciprocation. Call me Tony. Can I help you with something, Mr. Lewis? His smile flickered. Just for a second. I've noticed you. The way you move through this place. You're different from the others. Justinta recognized the script. She'd heard variations of it before. Men who thought compliments were currency, who believed their attention was a gift she should be grateful to receive. That's kind of you to say. She moved to step around him, but his hand found her lower back, proprietary and presumptuous. Have dinner with me. Not a question. A statement dressed as an invitation. Tomorrow night. I know a place that makes Velvet Garden look like a cafeteria. For a moment, Justinta felt the weight of calculation. He was clearly wealthy, clearly connected, the kind of customer whose displeasure could cost her this job. But her mother's voice rang clear in her head. Never let anyone make you small, Justinta. Not for money, not for comfort, not for anything. She gently removed his hand from her back. I'm flattered, but no thank you. The temperature in Tony's eyes dropped 20 degrees. No? I don't date customers. Restaurant policy. It wasn't, but it sounded official enough. I'm not a customer. He stopped himself, but the implication hung in the air. I'm Tony Lewis. Don't you know who I am? I appreciate the offer, but I have to get back to work. Justinta's smile remained professional, but her feet were already moving, creating distance. She didn't see the way his jaw clenched. Didn't see the flush creeping up his neck. Didn't see his associates at their table trying to hide their smirks behind their whiskey glasses. But Tony saw them, and that was worse than the rejection itself. Everything okay? Jake, the bartender, asked quietly after Tony returned to his table. Fine. Justinta refilled her tray with glasses. But her hands were shaking slightly. She'd just said no to a man who clearly wasn't used to hearing it. Across the restaurant, Tony sat in rigid silence, his associates careful not to acknowledge what they'd just witnessed. A waitress had rejected him. In public. In front of people who mattered. She doesn't know who you are, man, one of them finally ventured. Probably some immigrant who just. Shut up. Tony's voice was ice, but the seed was planted. Immigrant. He'd noticed her accent, slight but present. The musical lilt in certain words. The way she pronounced her vowels with just a hint of something foreign, something other. For the next 2 days, the rejection festered. Tony couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop replaying the moment. The polite smile. The firm no. The way she'd walked away like he was nobody. Him. Nobody. His friends tried to distract him. Forget about her. There are 1,000 women who'd kill for a chance. I don't want 1,000 women. Tony stared out his penthouse window at the Chicago skyline he'd always believed belonged to him. I want her to understand who she said no to. So what are you going to do? Tony's reflection in the glass smiled, cold and calculated. I'm going to teach her a lesson about respect. About knowing her place. Tony, man, she's just a waitress. Exactly. He turned from the window, his decision made. And I'm going to make sure everyone in that restaurant remembers it. Wednesday passed. Thursday passed. By Friday evening, Tony had his plan perfected. He'd return to Velvet Garden. He'd request her specifically. And he'd orchestrate a moment so humiliating, so publicly devastating, that she'd never forget the cost of rejecting Tony Lewis. What he didn't plan for was what would happen after. What he didn't plan for was the universe's sense of irony. What he didn't plan for was that in less than 12 hours, he'd be the one begging for mercy, and she'd be the one with the power to grant it or deny it. But first, he had a lesson to teach. Or so he thought. The question that was supposed to humiliate her did the exact opposite. Friday evening arrived with the weight of inevitability. Justinta was clearing table 5 when Michael appeared at her elbow, his face carrying an expression she'd never seen before, something between apology and warning. Justinta, table 12 needs service. Now. She followed his gaze to the corner booth where Tony Lewis sat with 3 Korean associates, all of them watching her like predators who'd already chosen their prey. He requested you specifically. Michael's voice dropped. Just be professional. Don't engage. Don't react. Just do your job and get out. Justinta's stomach tightened, but she nodded. 3 days had passed since the rejection. She'd hoped he'd forgotten, moved on, found someone else to occupy his attention. Apparently, men like Tony Lewis didn't forget. She approached with menus and the wine list, her face a portrait of professional courtesy. Good evening, gentlemen. Can I start you off with? We'll have the 2015 Chateau Margaux. Tony didn't look up, just waved his hand dismissively. You do know what that is, don't you? His associates leaned forward slightly, waiting. Yes, sir. The Bordeaux. Excellent choice. Justinta kept her voice steady, refusing to take the bait. And, now he looked up, his eyes cold and calculating. Tell me, what would you pair with the dry-aged ribeye? Since you're apparently so knowledgeable. The trap was obvious. Answer wrong, and he'd mock her ignorance. Answer correctly, and, well, she could see he hadn't expected that possibility. The question was designed to expose her as an uneducated pretender playing dress-up in a world she didn't belong to. But Justinta had spent 2 years studying everything about this restaurant. The wines, the menu, the pairings. Not because she had to, but because excellence was the only shield people like her had against people like him. The Margaux would pair beautifully with the ribeye, actually. Her voice remained calm, professional. The tannins complement the marbling in the meat. But if you prefer something bolder to stand up to the char, the 2016 Barolo has notes of cherry and tobacco that elevate the smokiness. Silence descended on table 12. One of Tony's associates raised his eyebrows, impressed despite himself. Another shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the moment for what it was. Their boss's trap backfiring spectacularly. Tony's jaw tightened. The muscle beneath his eye twitched. She'd answered perfectly, and now he looked like a fool for asking. The humiliation he'd planned for her had somehow become his own. How? Educated, he said finally, the word dripping with sarcasm that didn't quite hide his bruised ego. I try to know the menu well, sir. It helps me serve our guests better. Justinta kept her expression neutral, but inside, her heart was racing. She'd won this round, and they both knew it. I'm sure you do. Tony's smile turned sharp, dangerous. His eyes scanned her face, looking for weakness, for an opening. Where did you say you were from again? And there it was. The shift. If he couldn't attack her knowledge, he'd attack something else. Something she couldn't defend with wine pairings and professional expertise. Chicago, sir. Born and raised. No. His voice changed, sharpened. Where are you really from? Justinta felt the floor beneath her feet become unstable. This wasn't about wine anymore. This wasn't about service or knowledge or professionalism. This was about something much darker, much more dangerous. I was born in Chicago. She kept her voice steady, but her hands were beginning to tremble. My parents are from Ghana. Tony leaned back in his seat, his smile widening like a predator who'd finally found the vulnerable spot. He glanced at his associates, making sure they were paying attention. Making sure they'd witness what came next. Ghana. He let the word hang in the air. Then he switched to Korean, speaking loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Listen to how she talks. Like someone from a third world country trying to sound educated. His associates chuckled nervously, uncertain where this was going but too loyal, or too afraid, to object. Justinta stood frozen, the wine list trembling in her hands. Every eye in the surrounding tables had turned toward them. The restaurant's comfortable murmur had died into uncomfortable silence. Tony switched back to English, his voice carrying across the dining room like a pronouncement. Third world accent. Third-class citizen. He looked her up and down with undisguised contempt. How does someone like you even get hired in a place like this? What, did you clean your way up from the kitchen? His associates erupted in laughter, sharp, cruel sounds that echoed off marble and crystal. And Justinta felt something inside her break. But what Tony didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know as he sat there basking in his perceived victory, was that karma was already in motion. Already speeding toward him at 85 miles per hour. Already preparing to deliver him broken and unconscious into the hands of the woman he'd just destroyed. The universe was about to teach Tony Lewis a lesson about humility. And Justinta Scholes was about to become the teacher. This story is about to take a dramatic turn. If you want to see what happens when karma catches up to cruelty, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and hit that like button. Drop a comment telling us what you would do in Justinta's situation. Now, let's see how this night unfolds. The wound that words inflicted was invisible, but everyone in that dining room felt it land. Third world accent. Third-class citizen. Tony's voice carried across Velvet Garden like a verdict being delivered from a throne. How does someone like you even get hired in a place like this? What, did you clean your way up from the kitchen? His associates' laughter exploded into the silence, sharp, performative, the kind of cruelty that required an audience to feel real. Justinta stood frozen at table 12, the wine list trembling in her hands. The crystal chandeliers above suddenly felt too bright, too exposing. Every eye in the restaurant had turned toward them. Conversations had stopped mid-sentence. Silverware hung suspended over plates. Even the soft jazz from the speakers seemed to fade into horrified silence. Heat flooded her face. Not embarrassment, she had nothing to be embarrassed about. But rage. Pure, burning rage that started in her chest and spread through her body like wildfire. 28 years of her parents' sacrifice. Her father's engineering degree that America refused to recognize, forcing him into factory work. Her mother's 3 jobs while pregnant, her hands raw from cleaning other people's houses so Justinta could have opportunities. The Ghanaian lilt in their English that they'd passed down to their daughter like a precious inheritance, reduced to a punchline by a man who'd never worked a day in his life. Third world. The words echoed in her head. Her mother's world. Her father's world. The world that had shaped her into someone who knew the value of hard work, of dignity, of treating every human being with respect regardless of their station. And this man, this entitled, cruel man who thought his money made him superior, was mocking it. Mocking them. Justinta's vision blurred, but she refused to let the tears fall. Not here. Not in front of him. Not in front of the customers who were watching with expressions ranging from pity to secondhand shame to carefully neutral avoidance. I'll bring your wine, sir. Her voice came out steady somehow, though it felt like someone else was speaking. Someone who could function while their world was being torn apart. She turned, her movements deliberate and controlled. One foot in front of the other. Past table 11 where the elderly couple she'd served for years looked away, too uncomfortable to meet her eyes. Past table 10 where a woman whispered something to her husband. Past the bar where Jake gripped the counter with white knuckles, his jaw clenched with impotent fury. Behind her, Tony's voice continued, loud enough to ensure she heard every word. Some people just don't know their place. That's what happens when you let anyone work anywhere these days. More laughter, more performance, more cruelty dressed up as entertainment. Justinta reached the kitchen doors and pushed through, the swinging panels closing behind her with a soft thud that felt like a coffin lid. The noise of the kitchen, clattering pans, shouted orders, the industrial hiss of dishwashers, surrounded her like a cocoon. She made it 3 steps before her knees buckled. Maria, one of the line cooks, caught her elbow. "Mija, what happened?" "You look." "I'm fine." But her voice cracked on the second word. "You're not fine. What did that bastard do?" Justinta shook her head, unable to speak. If she opened her mouth, everything would come pouring out, the humiliation, the rage, the devastating feeling of being reduced to nothing in front of dozens of people. Years of excellence, of kindness, of proving herself every single day, erased by a man who decided her accent made her less than human. She couldn't finish. Couldn't articulate what she needed because what she needed was impossible. She needed to unhear those words. Needed to unsee the faces of the customers who'd watched and done nothing. Needed to undo the last 5 minutes of her life. "Take a minute," Maria said firmly. "I'll tell Michael you needed a bathroom break." Justinta nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She walked to the employee restroom, locked the door behind her, and finally let the tears come, hot, angry tears that felt like acid burning tracks down her face. She looked at herself in the mirror. Same face. Same uniform. Same woman who'd walked into work 5 hours ago believing that kindness and hard work mattered. Believing that dignity was something you earned, not something that could be stolen by a cruel man with money and an audience. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A reminder. Night shift at Chicago Mercy starts at midnight. Don't be late. 6 more hours of pretending everything was fine. Then 12 hours of nursing rounds at the hospital. Then back here tomorrow to do it all again. Because she needed the money. Because quitting meant letting him win. Because people like her didn't have the luxury of walking away. Justinta wiped her eyes, straightened her uniform, and took a deep breath. She would go back out there. She would bring Tony Lewis his expensive wine. She would smile at other tables. She would survive this night the way her parents had survived worse. But as she opened the bathroom door, one thought burned clear and bright in her mind. I hope you get exactly what you deserve. The universe, as it turned out, was already working on it. In 3 hours, Tony's Maserati would meet a telephone pole. And Justinta would meet him again under very different circumstances. But this time, she'd be the one with all the power. Pride, as it turned out, was a terrible co-pilot. Tony left Velvet Garden at 10:47 p.m., his ego inflated by the humiliation he'd just orchestrated. His associates had laughed at all the right moments. The restaurant had witnessed his dominance. The waitress had learned her place. "That was brutal, man," one of his friends said as they walked to the parking lot. She needed to learn. Tony's voice carried no remorse, only satisfaction. People like her forget who runs this city. He slid into his Maserati, the leather seats still warm from the heated setting. The engine purred to life, a sound that always reminded him of power, of control, of winning. His phone buzzed with messages from other friends, people who'd already heard about the incident. News traveled fast in their circles. "Heard you put some waitress in her place tonight." Tears of joy. Tony smiled, typing back one-handed as he pulled onto Lake Shore Drive. The Chicago skyline glittered to his right, Lake Michigan a dark void to his left. Traffic was light for a Friday night. He pressed the accelerator, the speedometer climbing past 70, then 80. His phone buzzed again. He glanced down. The pedestrian stepped into the crosswalk at the worst possible moment. Tony's eyes snapped up. He jerked the wheel. The Maserati swerved violently, tires screaming against asphalt. He overcorrected. The car fishtail-ed, spun. The world became a blur of lights and metal and the sickening certainty that he'd lost control. The telephone pole came out of nowhere and everywhere at once. Impact. The sound of shattering glass and crumpling metal filled the universe. The airbag exploded into his face. His ribs cracked against the steering wheel. His head whipped forward, then back, his skull connecting with something hard. Pain, white-hot and all-consuming, then nothing. Darkness. Silence. Then sirens. White Maserati, single-vehicle collision, driver unresponsive. The 911 call crackled through emergency dispatch at 11:04 p.m. Male, early 30s, severe head trauma, possible internal bleeding, BP 90/60 and dropping. Paramedics worked frantically as they loaded Tony's unconscious body into the ambulance. At 11:52 p.m., Justinta Scholes pulled into Chicago Mercy Hospital's employee parking lot, her eyes still red from crying in her car during the drive over. She'd reapplied her makeup, but nothing could hide the exhaustion, the humiliation, the bone-deep weariness of being publicly destroyed. She clocked in at 11:58 p.m., pulling on her scrubs in the locker room. Night shift. 12 hours of saving lives while trying to forget that just hours ago, someone had tried to destroy hers. Justinta, glad you're here. Dr. Sarah Chen appeared in the hallway. We've got a busy night. Trauma coming in, MVA, critical condition, ETA 2 minutes. I'm ready. Justinta squared her shoulders, pushing everything else aside. This was what mattered, saving lives, being excellent at the one thing she could control. The ambulance arrived at 12:23 a.m. Male, 32, unresponsive, GCS of 6, multiple trauma. The paramedics burst through the emergency entrance, wheeling a gurney at full speed. Justinta looked up from the nurse's station and saw Tony Lewis' face. What would she do now? Time stopped when Justinta saw his face. Trauma Bay 3, let's move. Dr. Chen's voice cut through the chaos as paramedics rushed the gurney past the nurse's station. Justinta stood frozen, her clipboard clattering to the floor. The fluorescent lights illuminated Tony Lewis' pale, blood-streaked face, the same face that had sneered at her 3 hours ago. The same mouth that had called her third world, third class. The same man who'd laughed while destroying her dignity in front of dozens of witnesses. Now unconscious, broken, bleeding. Justinta, I need you on this one. Dr. Chen shouted. Now. Her legs moved on autopilot, carrying her into Trauma Bay 3 even as her mind screamed to stop, to walk away, to let someone else save the man who'd tried to destroy her. BP 85/55, heart rate 120, GCS of 6. The paramedic rattled off vitals as they transferred Tony to the hospital bed. Justinta's hands began cutting away his blood-soaked designer shirt, the fabric tearing easily under her trauma shears. Third world accent. His voice echoed in her head as she exposed his chest, already bruising from the impact. Start 2 large-bore IVs. Dr. Chen ordered. Justinta reached for the catheter, her hands trembling. This was the man who'd humiliated her. The man whose laughter still rang in her ears. The man who'd made customers she'd served for years look away in shame because helping her would have been uncomfortable. Justinta, IV, now. Dr. Chen's voice sharpened. She found the vein in his arm, easy, prominent. 1 stick and she'd have access. But her hands hovered, the needle gleaming under the lights. She could miss, could push the needle through the vein, could make this hurt more than it needed to. Did you clean your way up from the kitchen? His words, his cruelty, his absolute certainty that she was beneath him. Now he was beneath her. Literally, completely at her mercy. Justinta. Dr. Chen moved toward her, concerned. The needle went in. Clean. Perfect. First try. Because that's who she was. That's who her parents had raised her to be. But as she taped down the IV and reached for the blood pressure cuff, as she checked his pupils and called out numbers that would determine whether he lived or died, Justinta felt something dark and terrible stirring inside her. She'd done her job. She'd started the IV. But there were other procedures coming. Painful ones. Necessary ones. Procedures where a little extra pressure, a moment of roughness, would be completely justified by his critical condition. Foley catheter, Dr. Chen said, moving to intubate. Justinta pulled on fresh gloves, her eyes fixed on Tony's unconscious face. In 3 hours, he'd transformed from her tormentor to her patient. From untouchable to utterly vulnerable. The question burning in her chest wasn't whether she could save him. It was whether she wanted to make him suffer first. The catheter kit sat on the sterile tray like a test from the universe itself. Justinta stared at Tony's unconscious form, her gloved hands steady but her soul trembling. Dr. Chen was occupied with the intubation, her back turned. The other nurses were managing medications and monitors. For this moment, this procedure, Justinta was alone with the man who'd destroyed her. Foley insertion, she announced, her voice clinical and detached. She positioned herself, her hands moving through the familiar motions she'd performed hundreds of times. But this time was different. This time, every movement carried weight. carried choice, carried the possibility of justice that looked an awful lot like revenge. The catheter in her hand felt like power. She could insert it roughly, could cause pain that would register even through his unconsciousness, could make him suffer the way he'd made her suffer, and who would question it? He was a trauma patient. Discomfort was expected. Pain was unavoidable. Third-class citizen. His voice echoed in her memory. Her hands trembled. Just do it. Make him feel something. Anything. But then another voice. Her mother's, soft and steady. Justinta, baby, when someone tries to make you small, you don't become small. You become bigger. You show them what real strength looks like. The catheter went in smoothly. Professionally. With the same care she'd give to anyone. Justinta taped it in place, her jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Reposition for chest X-ray, Dr. Chen called out, finally securing the breathing tube. This was another moment. Another choice. Justinta moved to Tony's side, placing her hands on his shoulders to roll him. She could be rough, could let his head drop too quickly, could jostle his broken ribs in ways that would register as pain even through his altered consciousness. Her fingers dug into his shoulder slightly. Just a little pressure. Just enough to. Some people just don't know their place. His final words at the restaurant, delivered with such casual cruelty. But her mother's hands had been gentle even when they were exhausted from scrubbing other people's floors. Her father's voice had been kind even when America refused to see his worth. They'd taught her that dignity wasn't something you performed when people were watching. It was who you were when no one would ever know the difference. Justinta repositioned Tony with textbook precision. Gentle, careful, professional. Good, Dr. Chen said, reviewing the monitors. Vitals are stabilizing. You're doing great work, Justinta. But Justinta didn't feel great. She felt hollowed out, exhausted, like she'd just fought a war against herself and wasn't sure who'd won. The temptations kept coming. The blood draw, she could dig for the vein, make him bruise. The wound cleaning, she could scrub harder than necessary. The IV adjustment, she could infiltrate the line, cause swelling and pain. Each time, her hands hovered. Each time, the dark voice whispered, he deserves this. He deserves all of it. And each time, she chose otherwise. Not because he deserved mercy, but because she deserved to remain herself. By 2 a.m., Tony's condition had stabilized enough to transfer to ICU. Justinta stood by his bedside, exhausted and shaking, staring at the man who'd tried to destroy her humanity and had instead forced her to prove it. The real question wasn't what she'd do to him. It was what she'd say when he woke up. We're at the final chapter of this incredible story. If you've been with us this whole journey, show some love by hitting that like button and subscribing for more amazing stories like this one. Comment below. What would you have said to Tony in this moment? Now, let's see how this all ends. Consciousness returned to Tony Lewis like drowning in reverse. Pain came first, sharp, radiating from his ribs, his head, everywhere. Then confusion. White ceiling tiles, beeping monitors, the antiseptic smell of hospital. Then memory, the swerve, the pull, the impact, the darkness. His eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus. A figure stood beside his bed, checking his IV line with precise, professional movements. You're awake, the voice said. Female. Familiar. That's good. Your vitals are stable. Tony's vision cleared, and he saw Justinta Scholes in scrubs, a stethoscope around her neck, her face an unreadable mask of clinical detachment. His heart monitor spiked. The beeping accelerated. Try not to move, she continued, her tone perfectly neutral. You have 3 fractured ribs, a severe concussion, and internal bruising. You're lucky to be alive. Tony tried to speak, but the breathing tube in his throat made it impossible. His eyes went wide with recognition, with fear, with something that might have been shame if he'd ever learned what that felt like. Justinta noted something on his chart, her movements calm and measured. She adjusted his IV drip, checked his catheter, did everything a good nurse should do. But she didn't smile, didn't offer comfort, didn't pretend this was anything other than what it was. Finally, she leaned close, her voice dropping to a whisper only he could hear. I treated you the same way I treat every patient in this hospital. With professionalism, with care, with the dignity that every human being deserves. She paused, letting the words sink in. Even patients who don't believe other people deserve the same. Tony's eyes filled with something he'd probably never felt before, the crushing weight of being powerless in the presence of someone he'd tried to make powerless. Your insurance is excellent, by the way, Justinta continued, her voice still quiet, still steady. Money can buy you the best care, the best doctors, the best recovery. But it can't buy back the person you were before you decided that cruelty was entertainment. She straightened, returning to her professional distance. I could have hurt you tonight. Could have made you pay for every word you said to me. But that's not who I am. That's not who my parents raised me to be. She met his eyes directly. The difference between us isn't our accents or our backgrounds or our class. The difference is that I know my worth doesn't come from making other people feel worthless. Tony's heart monitor continued its frantic beeping. A tear slid down his temple. You'll recover fully, Justinta said, making a final note on his chart. Physically, at least. What you do with the rest is up to you. She walked toward the door, her shift finally ending as dawn began to break over Chicago. Nurse Scholes, Tony's voice came out as a hoarse whisper, the breathing tube having been removed while he was unconscious. She paused but didn't turn around. I'm sorry. The words were barely audible. Broken. Real. Justinta stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then, without looking back, she said, tell that to the next person you're tempted to make small. Not to me. And she walked away, leaving Tony Lewis alone with his monitors, his pain, and the devastating realization that the woman he'd tried to destroy had just saved his life, and in doing so, had proven herself infinitely stronger than he'd ever been. The sun rose over Chicago Mercy Hospital. Justinta clocked out, exhausted but unbroken. She'd faced her darkest temptation and chosen light. She'd been given the power to become what she hated and had refused it. That, she realized as she drove home through the early morning streets, was the truest victory of all. Not revenge, not vindication, but the unshakable knowledge that cruelty had tried to change her, and had failed completely. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, true strength isn't about power over others, it's about power over yourself. Subscribe for more inspiring stories, and we'll see you in the next one.